I don't know why we leaving Mouse's house. He been good to us. He feed us on Saturday, close us on Sunday, and then beat us on Monday. Or was it Tuesday? I don't know.
Jasper, I just want to go. I was a house nigga, Jasper.
What?
Jasper, don't you want freedom? We going to Promised Land. The Promised Land.
Promised Land? Cleveland?
No, Jasper.
Baltimore?
No, Jasper, the Promised Land.
Oh, the Promised Land. Minnesota?
And cut.
Hi, my name is Robert Taylor, and I'm a black actor. I had to learn to play these slave parts, and now you can too, at Hollywood's first black acting school. It teaches you everything. Learn Jive Talk 101.
You motherfucking jive turkey motherfucker.
All right, that's good. You'll work. All right, you try it.
You fucking mothers.
No, man, no, that's wrong. Watch me, man. Just be cool. Jive, tricky motherfucker!
Good work. That's only the beginning. You too can learn to walk black.
No rhythm. Observe.
Yes. You too can be a black street hood. But this class is for dark-skinned blacks only. Light-skinned or yellow blacks don't make good crooks. It's Hollywood's first black acting school. It teaches you everything.
Classes are enrolling now. Learn to play TV pimps, movie muggers, street punks. Courses include Jive Talk 101, Shuffling 200, Epic Slaves 400, Dial 1-800-555-COON.
Black Acting School.
Don't try to be cool. Call Hollywood's first black acting school.
All right.
Today.
As we head toward the 21st century, the role of the mass media in society is being hotly debated. The term, the politics of the image, refers to this contestation and struggle over what is represented in the media. This program examines this debate by focusing on the work of one of the world's leading experts on media issues. Stuart Hall is Professor of Sociology at the Open University in England, and for the last 30 years has been at the forefront of work concerning the media's role in society. Hall is very closely identified in media studies with an approach known as cultural studies, and he starts with one of its central concepts, representation. The usual meaning of this term is connected with whether the depiction of something is an accurate or distorted reflection. In contrast to this, Hall argues for a new view that gives the concept of representation a much more active and creative role in relation to the way people think about the world and their place within it. This new view of representation is central to thinking about communication in much more complex ways. Hall shows that an image can have many different meanings, that there is no guarantee that images will work in the way we think they will when we create them. Now, sometimes Hall's concern with drawing attention to the complexity of communication is seen as downplaying the idea that the media have real and strong effects on the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. Hall understands that communication is always linked with power, that those groups who wield power in a society influence what gets represented through the media. Hall wants to hold both these ideas, that messages work in complex ways and that they are always connected with the way power operates in any society, together at the same time. He examines our everyday world where knowledge and power intersect. One way he does that is through what he calls interrogation of the image. The idea of interrogation normally brings to mind asking hard questions of a suspect. But how do we interrogate an image? By examining it, asking the hard questions about it, rather than just accepting it at face value. Just as a good interrogator looks behind the suspect's story or alibi, so must we probe inside and behind the image. Why should we think this way about images? Marshall McLuhan once said he wasn't sure who discovered water, but he was pretty sure it wasn't the fish. In other words, when we are immersed in something, surrounded by it the way we are by images from the media, we may come to accept them as just part of the real and natural world. We just swim through them, unthinkingly absorbing them as fish in water. What cultural studies would like us to do is to step out of the water in a sense and look at it, see how it shapes our existence, and even critically examine the content of the water. What follows is a talk that Stuart Hall gave at the University of Westminster in London. I hope your response mirrors my own when I first heard him lecture. I was an undergraduate student in England in the 1970s, and Stuart came to speak at the university I was attending. Through his energy, his passion, his modesty, he convinced me of the value of what he calls the intellectual vocation, the notion that ideas matter, that they are worth struggling over, that they have something to tell us about and can influence the world out there beyond the academy. In this way, he insists on the role that intellectual work can play in helping to regain control of an image-dominated world that has drifted beyond the democratic reach of ordinary people.
Just let me say what the main theme of what I'm going to say today is. I'm going to talk about the notion of representation, which is a very common concept in cultural studies and in media studies kinds of work. But I want to explore the idea a little bit, and I want to try and say something about how I understand representation working and why it's a more difficult and more complex subject than it appears to begin with. I'm talking about largely visual representation, or the examples I'm going to try to cite are from visual representation, but I think what I'm going to say has a bearing on the practices of representation in general. I choose visual representation because it's a kind of cliche to say that in the modern world, our culture is saturated by the image in a variety of different forms. The image itself, whether moving or still, and whether transmitted by a variety of different media, seems to have become the privileged sign of late modern culture. And late modern culture is not only that culture which one finds in the advanced industrial, post-industrial societies of the Western world, but because of the global explosion in communication systems, it is also the saturating medium, the saturating idiom of communication worldwide. So I think to try and take the idea of representation to the image is an important question. And cultural studies has paid a tremendous amount of attention in one way or another to the centrality of representations and of the practice of representation. And media studies itself is, in an obvious sense, concerned in part with the variety of different texts, in my instance, visual texts, representations, which are transmitted by the media. But I'm going to stand back from that a bit to begin with and try and look at the process of representation itself. Now, the word has a kind of double meaning, even in its common sense, understanding. It does mean to present, to image, to depict, to offer a depiction of something else. And the word representation or representation does sort of carry with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. Nevertheless, this notion that somehow representation represents a meaning which is already there is a very common idea, and on the other hand, one of the ideas that I'm going to try to subvert. So I give you the common sense meaning to try to take it back a little bit in what I'm going to say. But then there's another understanding of the word representation, which also plays a role in what we bring to this topic, because we speak of political figures as representing us in some way. We don't probably say that very often these days because we may not think they represent us very well, but they're sort of supposed to represent us, and in that sense, they stand in for us. They are our representatives. Where we can't be, they can be. So the notion of something which images and depicts and that which stands in for something else, both of those ideas are kind of brought together in the notion of representation. Now, what this idea that the media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations. What we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about. And if you think that the meaning that it is giving is very different from or a kind of distortion of what it really means, then your work on representation would be in measuring that gap between what one might think of as the true meaning of an event or an object and how it is presented in the media. And there's a lot of very good work which is in media studies, which is exactly like this. I think the truth is that in cultural studies now, and in a great deal of media studies work, that notion of representation is regarded as too literal and too straightforward. And the reason for that is because we want to ask the question of whether events, the meaning of people, groups, what they're doing, etc., whether these things do have any one essential, fixed, or true meaning against which we could measure, as it were, the level of distortion in the way in which they're represented. Suppose one says, yes, I can see that people are meeting now in Northern Ireland to discuss the Northern Ireland situation. But what it means, what is the meaning of that meeting, is a very complicated thing to decide. You'd have to know not only the whole history of what led up to it, you'd have to know what each of the participants wants out of it, you'd have to know some assessment of what the consequences of that event are likely to be before you could say, what is the meaning? And we all know absolutely clearly, the one thing you can be certain of is that there will never be one interpretation of what is going on in Northern Ireland today. Absolutely. It will always be a contested question. There will never be a finally settled, fixed meaning. The one thing you can say about those events is that there is no one true fixed meaning about it. Well, now, this is a different situation. In a way, what we're saying now is that representation doesn't really capture the process at all, because there was nothing absolutely fixed there in the first place to represent. Of course, there was something. People are meeting, they're talking, they're arguing with one another, they're going to take decisions, consequences will follow. So, not that nothing is happening in the world, but what is dubious is what is the true meaning of it. And the true meaning of it will depend on what meaning people make of it. And the meanings that they make of it depends on how it is represented. The meaning of an event in Northern Ireland does not exist until it has been represented. And that's a very different process. Now we're talking about representation, not as an after-the-event activity. It means something, and then the presentation might change or distort the meaning. We're talking about the fact that it has no fixed meaning, no real meaning in the obvious sense, until it has been represented. And the representations, since they're likely to be very different as you move from one person to another, one group or another, one part of society and another, one historical moment and another, just as those forms of representation will change, so the meaning of the event will change. Now, what this means is, in fact, that the process of representation has entered into the event itself. It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't exist meaningfully until it has been represented. And that, to put that in a more highfalutin way, is to say that representation doesn't occur after the event. Representation is constitutive of the event. It enters into the constitution of the object that we're talking about. It is part of the object itself. It is constitutive of it. It is one of its conditions of existence. And therefore, representation is not outside the event, not after the event, but within the event itself. It is constitutive of it. If cultural studies was simply about trying to understand the distortions which the media make of a meaning whose truth we could somehow find independently of the media, it would be a very different kind of study from what it is in fact, which is trying to find out how the meanings enter into the event themselves, how they help to constitute the event. And this, what we're talking about is really why in cultural and media studies of this kind, at any rate, the notion of culture becomes a primary force. It's not a secondary element, but it's a primary element. Culture is the way in which we make sense of or give meaning to things of one sort or another. It's true, of course, that we all don't make sense of things in the same way, and therefore that each of us has a little kind of conceptual world of our own, or rather we have our own sort of take on the conceptual world. But if we shared no concepts together with other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in, broadly speaking, the same ways. Cultures consist of the maps of meaning, the frameworks of intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists but is ambiguous as to its meaning until we've made sense of it. So meaning arises because of the shared conceptual maps which groups or members of a culture or society share together. And that's a very important kind of way of coming to an understanding of why in cultural studies, if you privilege the notion of representation as giving meaning, you're making culture a very central, you're giving it a kind of central role. Yes, it's not just sort of the values and things which we happen to have been born into. It literally is the ways without which we would find the world unintelligible. Okay, what then is sort of the basis of a culture, and consequently of cultural studies, is to try to begin with what are the shared conceptual maps. That's to put it another way, to give you another way into this notion. What are the ways in which we classify and organize the world? Because classification is not the only, but one of the principal ways in which we go about giving meaning to things, until we know roughly what class of things it is, roughly what it belongs with, and roughly what it's different from. Chairs are like stools because you sit on them. And both of them are different from tables which you put things on, although you can also sit on tables and so on. Our systems of classification are very complex, But without some notion of this belongs with that, that is different from this, we wouldn't be able to have a conceptual map. We wouldn't be able to map out the world in some intelligible way. Now, where do we get that from? Well, the one thing you can be certain is that though the capacity to use concepts and to classify concepts in this way is a biological or genetic phenomenon, it's a feature of how we are constituted as human beings, the particular classifications that we use to classify out the world meaningfully is not printed in anybody's genes. It is something which is learned. It may not be learned in didactic ways at school or in colleges or through instruction, formal instruction, but to become a human subject is precisely somehow to learn or internalize the shared maps of meaning with other people in your culture. To become a cultured subject rather than a biological individual, rather than just a blob of genetic material, is to move from there, to internalize, have within oneself the kind of the beginnings of the grid of one's culture. Okay, one could say then that the conceptual maps in our heads which allow us to come to a sense of what is going on in the world is itself a system of representation. Our concepts are a way of representing the world. And you can think of that in a very simple way. I mean, bear in mind an object which you cannot see. Now, unless you had a concept of it, it would disappear the moment that the object had gone from sight. But concepts allow us to store and indeed to refer to and to think about, or have quite complicated thoughts about objects which are no longer accessible to our perceptual apparatus. So the concepts allow us also to think about a wide range of things which are not in any simple sense out there in the world. And it's a very rich notion. Our fantasy life is full of things which are absolutely real to us, which are probably real if we can only find a language to express them, lots of other people, which nobody's ever seen. So we're beginning to dissolve now any simple-minded notion that our concepts are just mirror images of the world out there. They're also mirror images of worlds that don't exist. So our concepts operate as a system of representation, but we haven't finished the circle yet, because suppose we all shared the same conceptual map. That's to say, we made sense of the world in roughly the same way. And we classify those concepts. We have the same system of classification in our heads. How would I know that you are making sense of the world in anything remotely like the way in which I am? I can only know that if you could in some way express or communicate the sense you are making to somebody else. And that second move requires that the concepts find their way through language into communication. So we've not talked about communication yet, but you see, the question of communication and language completes the circle of representation. First of all, they're the shared conceptual maps or cultures that we inhabit, but very closely associated with that are the ways in which different languages, and by language here, of course, I mean a very wide range of things. I mean the language that we speak, I mean the language that we write, I mean electronic languages, digital languages, languages communicated by musical instrument, languages communicated by facial gesture, languages communicated by facial expression, the use of the body to communicate meaning, the use of clothes to express meaning. Anything in the sense in which I'm talking about can be a language. By that I mean it gives sign to the meanings that we have in a form which can be communicated to other people. Language externalizes. It makes available and accessible as a social fact, a social process, the meanings that we are making of the world and of events. And it's at that point that that representation really begins to take off, close the circle of representation. one of the things which people who've gotten to this point without sort of understanding where they're going suddenly want to say is, oh my goodness, are you telling me that there is nothing but language, nothing but discourse? The only thing that exists is meaning. And this is a very common complaint. It sort of occurs, for those of you who teach media studies, in about, the middle of the second term. Really, it's my view. That's about the point where students suddenly shake their heads, wake up, and say, it's nonsense, there are lots of things in the world apart from meaning and language. How do you trap me into this sort of language box, this language circle, How do you get me into this circle? Anyway, then let me try and make a very simple distinction about two statements which sound as if they're exactly the same, but which in my view are absolutely different. The first statement is, nothing meaningful exists outside of discourse. I think that statement is true. On the other hand, nothing exists outside of discourse. In my view, that statement is wrong. The statement, nothing exists outside of discourse, is a sort of claim that, as it were, there is no material existence, no material world at all, no objects out there, and that is patently not the case. But to say that nothing meaningful exists outside of discourse is a way of summing up what I think I've been trying to say to you. As far as meaning is concerned, you need discourse, i.e. the frameworks of understanding and interpretation, to make meaningful sense of it. And I'll try to give you an example. Round, spherical, rubber or leather object is a ball. Is it a football? Well, you need a round spherical object to play football. But it's only football in the context of a set of rules about what you can and can't do with the ball, which the ball didn't make up. You have to make up. So the ball only, which is a physical object, only becomes meaningful as a football within the context of the rules of the game. It's only when you develop a game or a language game about football. You can put it there, you can't put it there, you can't touch it, you can't kick it, etc. Within the rules, it becomes a football. So it's meaningful as a football only in the context of the use and the meanings with which it is invested. The notion that meaning is important doesn't require us to deny that human beings have a physical existence, that objects have a physical existence, that we live in a material world which is governed by the laws of the physical world, and so on. It doesn't require any of that. The question of discourse